Hi, Richard.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Richard Wrangham, very distinguished and well-known primatologist at Harvard, by and large. Are you at Harvard at the moment?
I am. Yep.
Okay.
I mean, literally,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm not in my department today, but that's where I hang out.
Yeah. You're in the Cambridge, Massachusetts vicinity.
Right.
And you've written a number of books and papers, certainly. We're going to talk about your most recent book. It's called The Goodness Paradox. I've actually seen the subtitle rendered two ways. On my audible.com version, it says The Strange Relationship Between Peace and Violence in Human Evolution. But I've seen renderings of the cover online where it says The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. So yeah, I gather there was some discussion of the subtitle up to last minute.
To be honest, I'm not aware of the subtitle for the Audible version being discussed at all. Someone just did that. Yeah,
as they are inclined to do. Well, they found somebody with a British accent to do the voice, so for all we know, it's you. You'll be happy about that. It was an authentic sounding voice.
And then there's a British version of the book which says the subtitle is How Evolution Made Us More and Less Violent.
Okay. Well, is that fair in your view? Well, we can start discussing the thesis right away, I guess. Is that a fair summary? So one thing you're doing in the book is explaining why, in a certain sense, we're as good as we are, and in your view, better than our ancestors were. And that is to say that there's a certain kind of violence that we are less inclined to commit than our ancestors were. And that is basically violence within the group. Well, there's two ways of framing that. You make a distinction. There's a couple of dimensions along which you divide violence, and we'll get to all of that. But anyway, there's an important sense in which we're less violent than our ancestors, in your view, and you have an explanation for that. It's domestication, broadly speaking. We've gotten kind of tamer, just the way dogs, relative to their wolf ancestors, got tamer. Except in our case, there wasn't another species doing the domestication. We did the domestication, and we'll come to that. That's of course not the same as saying that our propensity for intergroup aggression has declined, and we'll come to that as well. But and you have, I should say, a particular variant of the domestication hypothesis called the execution hypothesis, which is.
Yes, right. That's an interesting way to put it. A variant of the domestication hypothesis, but yeah.
And that just, I don't want to spoil the plot right now, but the execution hypothesis is about as grim as it sounds if you're thinking about execution in the sense of killing someone. So we'll come to all that. Before we get to the book, I just wanted to ask you. You started out studying under somebody who's probably the most famous primatologist ever, certainly the closest to a celebrity primatologist. That's Jane Goodall.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if how your views, how that shaped your views, how maybe they've changed since then. I think I read somewhere that Jane Goodall herself started out with a more sanguine view of like chimpanzee nature, for example, than she wound up with. I don't know if that's true, but do you want to talk about a little?
Everybody did.
What's that?
Everybody did. So I came in 1970. That was when I arrived in Gombe. At that point, Jane Goodall had been studying chimpanzees for 10 years. She and her research team. And so at that point, very little was known about inter-community relationships or even really the existence of communities. Jane had described the fact that as she wandered the hills of Gombe, she would see chimps in different places. The further she went from her base camp, the less likely it was that she would see individuals that she knew. But she didn't really have a solid understanding of the fact that emerged around this time which was that every chimpanzee is very clearly a member of a social community and is an enemy of the neighboring social community. And it was only in 1974 that the first intimation of just how incredibly hostile the chimps are emerged with the killing in January 1974 of a chimpanzee called Hody by some members of the main study community. And Hody was in a break-off community, and by being in the break-off community, he had become an enemy of the main community. And that was the beginning of a series of killings that, of course, what happened was that everybody studying chimpanzees realized that we were dealing with a species that had quite unusual levels of violence compared to almost any other species.
And as it happens, they are as closely related to us as any other species. There's only one other species as closely related to us. These are the bonobos.
Right.
And maybe we should talk a little about chimpanzees and bonobos, because they only diverged as two separate species less than 1 million years ago, right? Which is not...
Yes, the dating is still a little bit uncertain. You know, it relies entirely on genetics, and rates of mutation are not quite confidently enough known. So it could be a little bit more than 1 million years, but it's that sort of thing.
And then long before that, the lineage that diverged had diverged from our lineage. That's multiple millions of years.
That'd be more like 7 or 8 million years, yep.
So if you're going to look to primate relatives of ours if you were inclined to look to them for clues as to our nature, you know, our genetic heritage, these are the two species you'd look at, but it turns out that they are pretty different. They have diverged quite a bit behaviorally over these 1 million or so years, right?
You're right. Absolutely astonishing. I mean, an extraordinary comparison where chimps are one of the most violent of species and bonobos are one of the least violent, one of the most unaggressive. And that's still emerging exactly how extraordinary it is in the sense that only this year people are still publishing evidence of the fact that bonobos have quite peaceful intergroup relationships. So they can play in incredibly trusting ways with members of neighboring groups. They can have sex with each other. They can share food with each other. They can groom each other. All things that, from a chimpanzee perspective, are completely surprising. So it's a wonderful contrast, and purely based on the genetics, there is absolutely no reason for thinking that chimpanzees or bonobos are any closer in terms of their evolutionary psychology to humans. You know, you have to go outside just the genetic basis, the genetic relationships, to be able to work out which one has got a psychological biases that are more likely to be ancestral to our own lineage.
And do you have a view as to which one is, in that sense, closer to us?
Well, I sure do. And the answer is chimpanzees. And the reason for that, there are kind of two reasons. One is that if you think about the chimpanzee-bonobo comparison, there is something really unusual and special about bonobos, which is that their brain and their skull, well, I should say their skull rather than their brain, is pedomorphic in relationship not just to chimpanzees, but to the great apes in general. And so they've got a very odd pattern of ontogenetic development of the skull, and it is associated with pedomorphic behavior. So it seems as though the skull is a good guide to behavior.
What does pedomorphic mean?
Excuse me. Pedomorphic means that you've got a juvenile characteristic that is retained into adulthood in the descendant species. And so you see this in dogs compared to wolves. That dogs are much more puppyish and learn better in life and have a juvenile sounding bark compared to wolves as adults. So dogs are in some ways a sort of rather juvenile version of a wolf. And you see that also reflected in their skulls. And that's what seems to be happening with bonobos. So it's very clear that bonobos have diverged away from the typical great ape pattern. Mm-hmm. And that suggests, of course, that chimps have diverged less from the great ape pattern. And that idea is supported by the second source of evidence, which is the similarity between chimpanzees and gorillas. So gorillas are, of course, bigger than chimps. And the significant genetic point is that, to everyone's surprise, in 1984, it was discovered when the first DNA analyses came out looking at the great apes and humans, that humans come off from in between chimpanzees and gorillas. And so you've got gorillas carving off maybe 10 million years ago, and humans carving off, or the Australopithecines as they were then, at, say, 7 or 8 million years ago, and then the chimp-bonobo lineage going off and separating from each other something like 1 to 2 million years ago. Well, why is it that chimpanzees and humans and gorillas look like each other? Because they look a lot like each other. I mean, basically, the thought experiment is that if you allow a chimpanzee to get bigger, it pretty much turns into a gorilla. There's not much change other than body size. You know, the changes that you see are kind of associated with the larger body size of gorillas than chimps. I think
gorillas is having a more protruded mouth area, but maybe I'm confused.
Well, no, you're not confused. But what has happened is that, as tends to happen in general, as you get a larger version of a species, then they eat lower quality food. Mm. And because gorillas are able to survive on low quality food, namely herbs and leaves on the forest floor, then they have a series of adaptations in terms of their teeth and their jaws, their muscles, and so on. But that's all associated with the larger body size.
Okay.
Anyway, so the point about gorillas and chimps looking basically rather similar is that the species that gave rise to the human lineage was in the chimpanzee-gorilla mold.
Okay.
And if it was smaller, it was more chimp-like, and if it was larger, it was more gorilla-like. And it obviously seems to have been smaller because the Australopithecines were all about chimp-sized.
And your view is that the ancestors of ours who did diverge from the chimp lineage were for some time thereafter, like chimpanzees, prone to both intra-group violence, killing people within groups, certainly attacking people within groups, and intergroup violence. But that the first kind of violence, intragroup, our propensity for that has declined significantly over the last few 100,000 years, right? And
yeah, roughly. I mean, the thing is that you are saying intra-group versus intergroup, within group versus between group, and it's true that the kinds of violence that we want to talk about it broadly falls into those two categories. But really what we should be distinguishing is not that quite that classification. We should be saying instead reactive aggression and proactive aggression.
Right.
And it's true that a lot of reactive aggression is associated with within group aggression, and a lot of proactive is associated with between group aggression, but there's not totally one-to-one. And what has apparently gone way down in humans, I mean, we certainly know it is way down now, is reactive aggression. So reactive aggression is losing your temper. It's emotionally aroused aggression where you are threatened by somebody. Somebody threatens your status. They threaten to take something away from you. They threaten to get between you and your wife. They threaten you in a way that your blood rushes up, you feel upset, and you immediately lash out. Mm-hmm. And you are so aroused that you might lash out at the person that's offended you and the person that's next to him and all over the place. Suddenly it's a fight. And you're liable to get hurt. Your opponent is liable to get hurt. It's kind of what we often think of as animal aggression, mm-hmm. associated with high levels of testosterone, with alcohol, with lack of sleep, various ways in which you have poor control over your emotions.
And then proactive is it fair to loosely equate that with premeditated?
Absolutely. That proactive is planned. It's called sometimes predatory, premeditated aggression, where you do not necessarily have any kind of emotional arousal at all. You are just determined to do something, and maybe sometimes the act of aggression is the goal. I want to kill someone because they've offended me or whatever, for some other reason. Sometimes the act of aggression may be incidental. I want to get that resource, that gold, whatever it is, and I need to kill someone in order to be able to get at it. Mm-hmm. So this is making a plan and involving aggression.
Okay, so you think we're roughly as proactive as our ancestors of 500,000 years ago, roughly as prone to proactive aggression, certainly not much less so, whereas we are much less prone to reactive aggression. People can probably see how this might map on somewhat to the intragroup thing. I mean, after all, most of the things you encounter people in your group a lot more than you do people outside of your groups. There's more stuff to react to. So if you're going to be losing your temper, that's usually going to be the cause of it. Whereas a lot of intergroup violence, even today, if we think of war and so on, there's a lot of calculation and planning and so on. Some people might be surprised by your assertion that we're not that prone to kind of hot violence, to losing their temper. I think people would say, I see a lot of that in the world. Every time I read about someone dying in the newspapers, somebody lost their temper, right?
Yeah, it's all a question of what your expectations are set by. If your expectations are set by the hope that people will never lose their temper with each other, then it's upsetting when you discover that occasionally people do. If your expectations are set, as mine are, by what happens among chimpanzees, or I might say bonobos, then you get a different picture. And very roughly, I think humans lose their temper with each other at about 1,000th of the rate that chimpanzees or bonobos do.
Wow.
We have now been able to use field studies to tot up how frequently fighting happens within a chimpanzee community. And the actual data that we have are several hundred times as frequent in chimpanzees as in an Australian hunter-gatherer community which was renowned for being unusually violent. Mm-hmm. So I reckon that for a sort of typical group, it'll be more like in the 1,000 times difference.
Okay. So your explanation for this, I guess there's two somewhat distinctive things about your book. First of all, you're arguing that domestication is the way to think about this, and other people have kind of argued that, but it's not a super common way to frame it, even now, I think. Am I right about that?
Yeah. The domestication argument, I think, was made most clearly originally by the archaeologist Helen Leach in 2004, I think it was, when she drew attention to the fact that over the last several 100,000 years, I think she was talking about 100 or 200, and now we can say 300,000. The changes that have happened in the human skull are very similar to what you see in domesticated animals descending from their wild ancestor. And so that sort of gelled, I thought maybe crystallized, I should say, an argument that people have said in general about humans sort of being like domesticated animals for centuries.
Mm-hmm. And in all of these other domesticated species, they are less aggressive or less prone to violence than their wild ancestors?
Yes, exactly. That's right.
That's part
which is why, going back to Aristotle, people have drawn comparisons between humans and domesticated animals because we just seem so incredibly unaggressive in terms of our ordinary day-to-day interactions compared to wild animals.
Now, if you had asked me, well, why did we become tamer? I might have said, and I'm not sure I'm willing to let go of this idea. I may elaborate on it later in the conversation after you get your theory out. But I might have said, well, as human, as language develops and cooperation becomes more elaborate among humans, there are various reasons you can imagine that violence would have been less in your interest. The costs might have risen. The benefits might have
Why would the
dropped.
costs have risen?
Yeah, but you have a very distinct and clear-cut conception of how the costs rose, right? So
Yes,
talk
absolutely.
about what you mean by the execution hypothesis.
Well, so to me, the big problem is this, that humans have a quite different pattern of alpha male dominance relationships to any other primate. And our pattern is that in small-scale societies, in mobile hunter-gatherers and small-scale horticulturists, people without chiefs, then what you have is egalitarian relationships among men, in which no man can sort of follow the norms while trying to exert his own authority over other men. But occasionally what happens is that some man goes against the norms and he tries to bully others. Maybe he will take more than his fair share of meat, just literally grab it. Maybe he will challenge another man for a wife and take a wife, literally physically grabbing her by the wrist and pulling her away and pushing the other man away and so on. And this is more like what primates do, where they use their individual physical strength to control someone. Well, there is only one ultimate way that people in small-scale societies are able to deal with that problem. They don't have any police. They don't have a law that's got any teeth behind it, other than eventually controlling that man physically. And controlling that man physically means executing him. If persuasion, ridicule, ostracism, singing in his face, if various social mechanisms like that don't work. And so I think that what has happened over evolutionary time is that people have had to resort to that. Why do I think that? Because even now, it's amazing. In hunters and gatherers from around the world, you have records of individuals who try it on sometimes, who need to be controlled by execution. Well, this is even though we are now incredibly down-regulated in our status competition and our willingness to lose our tempers compared to chimpanzees, which provide an interesting model in that respect.
So the idea is that you assume that this unusually assertive person who's annoying everyone and breaking the rules and just taking stuff from people, you assume that propensity, maybe not in every individual cases, but in a fair number of cases, has a genetic basis that has to do somewhat with distinctive genes that person has. So if they kill that person, they're removing those genes from the gene pool. Of course, they're not thinking of it that way. They're just thinking, let's get rid of this guy. But you're saying that over time, this would have had a domesticating effect on the species if troublemakers are killed.
Yes, exactly. And there is a base for thinking how long that's been going on. Because if you take the features of the human skull that echo those of domesticated animals, then we see them going back to 300,000 years ago, which is the origin of Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is characterized by having features in the skull that recall those of domesticated animals. So the idea is that for 300,000 years, we have had increasing reduction of reactive aggression, or reactive aggression has been increasingly reduced. And then the question is, what is the mechanism? And I go for this very harsh idea of execution as being necessary to control it. The kind of alternatives that are much more favored from a point of view of, political correctness or just sort of charm of the human species, maybe females preferred nicer males, or males preferred nicer other males as cooperative partners to go hunting. And those, are very plausible ideas in the sense that nowadays it is true in hunter-gatherers that people tend to prefer those kinds of individuals. The problem is, how do you get to the state where you have humans in which there are no males who are trying to exert their will simply by their individual physical strength in the way exactly what an alpha male chimpanzee does, or an alpha male baboon, or an alpha male gorilla. You know, they use their personal, individual, physical fighting ability to control everyone else. Humans don't do that.
By the way, how much of this is there in bonobos? There are no big alpha male problematic alphas in among bonobos? Or, I mean,
well,
first of all,
bonobos are really interesting. So bonobos do have alpha, they have a dominance hierarchy. Sometimes the individual who appears to be right at the top is a female, and sometimes it is a male. If it's a male, he always has one feature about him, which is that he's got a living mother. When his mother dies, then he falls in dominance. She is quite clearly supporting him in his ability to dominate others. But he doesn't show anything like the level of domineering behavior that a chimpanzee does. In fact, you know, here's one beautiful example of the difference. Chimpanzee males, they use sexual coercion a lot. They intimidate females, they beat them up, and the male who has a particularly aggressive relationship with a particular female significantly elevates his probability of being the father of her next baby. Got beautiful data on that now. Okay, with bonobos, people looked at this and they said, okay, now bonobos don't have any sexual coercion by males at all. So what's going to happen? In both species, chimpanzees and bonobos, the females are assiduous at mating all of the different males. It's vital for them to mate all the males, because otherwise, if a male is not a potential father, he might commit infanticide to her next baby. Mm-hmm. So, but now the bonobo female is free to mate whichever male she wants. So does that mean that there is less of a relationship between male hierarchy and reproductive success? You might think so, and that's what people expected. In chimps, the highest ranking males, they do better than the lower ranking males. What about bonobos? Well, it turns out, amazingly, that bonobos are even more concentrated, the paternity, in the top ranking males. But it's not because of coercion. It's because now the females are able to express their choice. And they really prefer those top ranking males. So there's a huge difference, but nevertheless, it still pays to be very high ranking in bonobos.
Okay, but you can imagine in humans, I mean, if the hypothesis you're being skeptical of is the one that females preferred nice, non-disruptive males, you can imagine alphas who are nice and not disruptive. In other words, they're not exploitive, but they're still alphas. In fact, in a way, aren't you kind of saying that is the direction in which our species had moved relative to chimpanzees? In other words, there is a status hierarchy in a hunter-gatherer society, but it does not express itself in tyranny and exploitation. They're relatively egalitarian.
Yes, it's relative. I mean, you know, hunter-gatherers, they're still very clearly patriarchal. And females who do things that disturb the male consensus are vulnerable themselves to being executed, actually. So, you know, there's still a lot of coercion and violence. One should not exaggerate the extent to which females were free in hunter-gatherer society. But nevertheless, they were freer than in chimpanzee society.
Right. But there's not as much what you could call gender equality as in bonobo societies.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, bonobos are often called matriarchal, and that actually seems an appropriate word for them, whereas chimpanzees very clearly patriarchal. Every single male dominates every single female. Now,
this is as good a place as any to put in all the disclaimers. I mean, you have a particular disclaimer in your book that you shouldn't be mistaken as favoring capital punishment just because it may have played a role that had some benign consequences in our history. You're not saying war is unstoppable. You're not saying gender inequality is inescapable. And all these, what's natural is neither good nor unchangeable, right? So that's...
Yeah, right. But on the other hand, what I am saying is that we do have certain psychological biases that mean that that we we tend to go in certain, actually pretty unpleasant directions, and therefore we do need to be aware of those if we are going to try and make a better world.
Right. About what things are easy to change, what things are not so easy to change, and how you might go about changing things. So, okay, so you now your hypothesis, the execution hypothesis, it could, in theory, coexist with other hypotheses, right? I mean, you could have more than one evolutionary force moving things in the same direction in principle, right?
Yes, that's very reasonable. And things I'm in a female choice, it probably went along. The point about the execution hypothesis is it's a sine qua non, without which nothing. You absolutely need it, in my view. I do not see how you can eradicate consistently the genes of the reactive men, or in other words, the men who are willing to use their reactive aggression to dominate others. I don't see how you can eliminate those genes without execution. Okay.
Well, let me sketch out an alternative. I haven't thought about this much, but just as I was listening to your book, I was trying to come up with, less, you might say more gradualistic or less dramatic dynamics by which you could get some of this. I mean, one thing that's happening during this period is we're developing language, the ability to cooperate.
That's my hypothesis, of course, but I think it's right.
Right. So, if you imagine that, so imagine a time back when we were more like chimpanzees, when violence for strong males had been paying off. They go, they take your food. If you mess with them, they'll hit you. They're belligerent. They're unkind. It's working for them. Now, to the extent that the costs of that violence rise, even short of execution, obviously execution is the ultimate cost. Your genes are gone. But if you're even, the more pushback, the more people who are punching you in the face back, the more the cost rises, because who knows, every 20th time you could get a concussion, you could lose teeth, then you're less attractive, then you have more trouble eating, whatever. I mean, there are these kinds of marginal costs, right? You can imagine if the marginal cost of violence grows, that might discourage violent genes. So I'm thinking, so as language is developing, what if the kinds of people who used to get picked on and had nothing they could do about it now can resort to a coalition, to friends who will collectively, and say and talk to them and collectively make sure that the aggressor pays at least more of a price than the aggressor used to pay, right? If so, violence is more costly.
So the coalition is larger, something like that?
What's that?
You're saying the coalition might be larger, and therefore
the coalition might be larger, and so the clever people might start defeating the aggressive people, the people who could orchestrate a coalition, and so you might. I mean, that dynamic, could that in principle give rise to the same trend?
Well, I mean, I take the point that reactive aggression has often declined over evolutionary time in all sorts of different species without execution being part of it. For instance, in bonobos, and in island species, and in all, half the species in the world that you look at nowadays will probably have had ancestors that were more aggressive than themselves, just as the other half would have had ancestors that were less aggressive than themselves, if aggression has changed at all. So I'm not saying that execution is the only way that it can happen, but I do think that the present is the key to the past. So, if you take, in island populations of rodents, it seems quite likely that what's happened is that increasing population density has led to a increasing difficulty for a male to keep everybody out of his territory, and therefore he just gives up and then becomes peaceful. That's one model of what happens on islands. Is there something like that that's happened in humans? I don't think so, because in humans we still have males who want to try and dominate others, and if the present is the key to the past, look at what has happened in hunters and gatherers. Every continent where you have hunters and gatherers, what you have is evidence of execution of the bullies. And no other effective mechanism. You talk about a coalition, and a coalition might be all the other males in the group get together and sort of form a barrier and somehow stop this guy from getting access to whatever it is you want him to get access to. But that's not what happens.
Right. Well, also, I mean, at some point, the two scenarios merge. In other words, if the coalition is big enough, it is basically the society. And if they beat the guy up very badly, that could have some consequence in terms of his likelihood of surviving and reproducing. It could lower his status, for example, and reduce his reproductive success. And then if they kill him, of course, that's even worse. But in other words, sufficiently in a hunter-gatherer society, and we keep referring to them because the context of evolution for a long time was, by definition, that, in the sense that there wasn't agriculture, and we don't have good behavioral kind of fossils, so to speak. We can't really look at what was actually going on 50,000 years ago, but a number of hunter-gatherer societies have been observed and are in the anthropological record, and for all the deficiencies of that kind of record, it's kind of the best we've got. And and again, I guess you'd say, look, in a hunter-gatherer society, once a coalition gets very big, it's the whole society killing the guy, right? That's what, in effect, is happening. Right.
And I mean, the version of the execution hypothesis that I take to be correct, all of which, by the way, comes from this guy, Christopher Boehm, who is the one who has really, over the last 30 years, been accumulating the ethnographic evidence that makes this very convincing.
That's Boehm or Boem?
Yes, Boehm.
Right.
From the University of Southern California and the Santa Fe Institute. And so the idea is that when these executions occur, they essentially are the whole community doing it. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes it is literally they all get together and they say to themselves, say to each other, we need to get rid of this guy. Let's make a plan. Mm-hmm. At other times, somebody will, I don't know, put an arrow in the back of the guy and then say to everybody else, I did this. I hope everyone agrees. He was such a jerk. We needed to do something about him. Mm-hmm. So you get, post hoc rationalization. Mm-hmm. But either way, the community is meant to be involved. So it really is a community decision.
Mm-hmm. In any event, I gather you were motivated along this line of inquiry by just the stark contrast between life in hunter-gatherer society and, for that matter, in human society, and what you had observed in various primates, including our nearest relatives.
Yes, although actually, for me, this began with a comparison of chimps and bonobos. Mm-hmm. You get this astonishing sort of chimp is to bonobo as a wolf is to dog. And then it emerges that, guess what? Humans are like a dog. Mm-hmm. And so then there's the question of, well, how do we become a dog rather than a wolf? How do we become sapiens rather than our mid-Pleistocene ancestor that had this great big broad skull and big differences between males and females, indicating that they were a typical aggressive primate.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a theory as to what happened with bonobos?
Yes, absolutely. I think the evidence is that bonobos got across the Congo River, which the Congo River is a very old river, and it looks as though for a long time there were no great apes south of the Congo River. And then in a drying period, which could well have been the one at 1 million years ago, a population of chimps got across and entered this new land. So this new land is very similar to the land occupied by the chimpanzees on the right bank, the north side of the Congo River. There's one big difference. And the difference is that there are no mountains. And in the absence of mountains, you don't have the kinds of foods that will sustain gorillas during dry periods, which is, for me, the explanation of why there are no gorillas on the left bank of the river. So you've got chimpanzees who co-occur with gorillas on the right bank, now moving onto the left bank, and there are no gorillas. And the bonobos are able to eat the kinds of foods that gorillas eat in the lowlands in a way that enables them to forage much like gorillas. Gorillas stay in stable groups because the foods we're talking about are the continuously distributed herbs on the forest floor, where you can just walk a few yards, munch on. You don't have to separate from your group in order to be able to find a new little food patch. And what that did was it meant that in bonobos, females were always able to stay together with each other. And they developed trusting alliances such that if a male ever attacked them or got out of hand in some way, particularly maybe was aggressive to their infants, then the females would all join together and chase the male. And so what I think happened in bonobos, again, I think the present is the key to the past. If a male bonobo loses his temper, then the females all get together and chase him.
So the females did the domesticating in bonobos, in your view, and the males did it in humans.
Exactly. That's right. And that's how I say, it's because the present is the clue. And you can rationalize it. You can say, in humans, you would never have had the kinds of groups based on contemporary hunter-gatherers in which females were constantly together. The females break up into groups and forage in different places. The males go off and forage in different places. There's a different dynamic altogether from bonobos.
Okay. Now talk a little about the connection you see between this kind of domestication of humans and the moral sense, our sense of right and wrong and having a conscience and everything.
Well, I think of the whole process in two steps. So the first step is that when you get sufficiently good language that people are able to form conspiracies and say, it's time that guy, Bert, was sent back to the witches, then you start inadvertently selecting against reactive aggressive genes. And the result is that you have self-domestication in the sense of a calmer species in which individuals lose their tempers less readily. So that's step one. Well, then step two, although it may have happened at the same time, but I like to separate them conceptually, is the one where the males have now realized that they are able to control even the most aggressive individual bastard in the group. That is the alpha male, the guy who would be his own personal king. They realize now they can control him because they can chat together and make an agreement. We're going to get rid of him. And by the way, a very important feature of that is that they can do it through proactive aggression, which means they're not fighting. There's very little risk to themselves. In other words, they can plan in a way that kills somebody without you getting hurt. And if it means approaching him when he's asleep and dropping a big rock on his head, well, it may seem sort of, rather not playing by the rules, but it's effective. Okay, so once they've got this power, then they also realize that they can exert that power on anybody in the group. That is, a wimpish man who is not necessarily trying to be the big alpha, but simply is, trying to sleep with other men's wives. Or a woman who is too provocative and, they say a nymphomaniac, as it were. A woman who is interested in having sex with everybody, even if she's someone else's wife. Those are two particularly sort of stark biological problems about sexuality. But any kind of individual who is a nonconformist from the point of view of the interests of the males now becomes vulnerable to being coerced by those males. And so the simple short story is that the males who've discovered they can kill the alpha bully, the tyrant, they can kill anybody, and they will if those other individuals are doing something that is against the interests of those males. And that's kind of what you see again. It's the present as a cue to the past. You see women and men who don't obey the societal rules being subject to execution. So I think that this would have led individuals who are vulnerable to those coercive powers to be much more willing to conform to what the males want. And that's going to have evolutionary effects in the long term, that individuals who sacrifice their own selfish interest for the sake of the group are going to do better. And the ones who are more selfish and less willing to listen to the norms, then they're going to get weeded out.
So in your view, if you ask why do people care so much what other people think of them, and relatedly, why do they have a sense of kind of doing right and doing wrong? In other words, complying with moral norms or not complying with moral norms. Part of the answer, in your view, is again this dramatic scenario that it wasn't only that maybe you get a little less in the way of goodies if you're not playing along. It's like you get killed.
Yeah.
And so the moral sense, so genes conducive to concern about what your peers think of you and conducive to the perception that you're doing right, complying with the norms, those genes would flourish.
Exactly. So obviously, there's a cultural overlay as well. I'm not suggesting that culture doesn't have very significant effects. Mm-hmm. Most people learn the rules and follow them because of what they have learned, because they realize that it's dangerous not to do so. But that in the past, what has happened is there's been selection for conformity, and that has led to the evolution of the moral senses. So I see no reason to invoke group selection. This seems to me to be a natural selective argument that favors moral conformity.
Right. We should say, for people who don't follow these things, in group selection, the idea is that in groups where everyone plays by the rules and sacrifices, those groups survive. Alternative groups, rival groups that are full of selfishness perish. And so, the first group's genes do better. There are problems with that under at least certain circumstances with the idea of that happening. And in any event, your view is it doesn't happen much. And it's more individual. It's more competition among individuals within the group that is shaping the gene pool. Again, with this scenario, you can imagine more kind of subtle, gradualistic variants where, as I said, maybe the unpopular people, their status is reduced. They have less access to mates, less access to food. You can imagine these things, but in your view, the dominant factor is actually getting killed for being an unpopular person. Yeah,
right. And I've lived with peoples in the Congo. I've read a lot of ethnography. I've certainly read a lot of Boehm's work, and I'm persuaded that it becomes very dangerous to be someone who is regarded as a little bit of an outsider, someone who's always got a different opinion, who's always got a sort of idea that maybe we can do something differently. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that what you see during times of stress, when the rains fail, well, whose fault is it? That guy's been acting weird recently. Mm-hmm. And then the sort of strange dynamic builds up such that, well, maybe if we kill him, then the rains will come back.
Well, isn't there data showing that in any society that has anything like a witchcraft category, like where someone is accused of being in any sense kind of demonic or that these tend to be the people that the group just wants to get rid of. They're not randomly selected, and accused of being witches or whatever the term is in the culture, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing random about it. It's all very much part of the intricacies of the way the society works, and it's very, very clear that individuals who have sort of just seem to be a little bit odd, mm-hmm. are the ones that are vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think he might be a witch.
Yeah. So I think now we did the standard disclaimers about you're not saying anything you describe is good, just even if it is part of human nature and so on. I want to actually make sure that something I said earlier is clear. When I said that we don't have behavioral fossils from 300,000 years ago, so we use hunter-gatherer societies. We're not saying the individual hunter-gatherers in terms of their genetic constitution are like the people 300,000 years ago. We're just saying that because in our society, we're not observing any human beings living under this circumstances that hunter-gatherers live under. Very small group of people, no high technology, and so on. We have to look at other people who are living that way. Now, a corollary of this is you're not, when you describe these hunter-gatherers who execute people, you're not saying that that is part of human nature that's disappeared, right? I mean, we have whatever genes might incline someone to agree to kill someone under these particular circumstances. Those genes are in us. It's just that when you live in a nation state where the state has monopoly on the use of violence, most of us don't have an opportunity to have that discussion, right?
Yeah, right. But it emerges incredibly easily, this ability to conspire against somebody who is upsetting the norms of the group. And the really tragic and dramatic example of this, in my view, is the bread laws that emerged in concentration camps in several different countries, in several different wars, actually, but most notably in the Second World War, where in the terrible conditions of the concentration camps, if somebody started stealing food from others, taking just more than their fair share of this tiny amount of bread that was not still enough to survive on, really, then they would be quietly killed by community consensus. And that to me just brings home how raw this behavior or the psychology of humans can be under the appropriate circumstances. And to be a hunter-gatherer is not an easy life.
Yeah. Well, and even in our life, when the stakes are not survival itself, I imagine there are a lot of people when like they hear of some terrible misfortune afflicting someone who is a bitter rival of theirs, possibly including even death, they don't talk about it. But I suspect in those situations, a lot of people are not exactly horrified to hear it happened, right? I mean, is there data on this, like getting honest reactions of people to the deaths of their rivals? I guess there's no way, right?
I don't know those data, but yeah, it would not be surprising after all. I mean, however peaceable people are, the great majority of people will end up doing terrible things in war.
Okay, so
you have sufficiently crystallized boundaries.
Yeah, so speaking of war, you have a whole chapter on war. Do you want to say because here we're talking about intergroup aggression, typically, well, it's always pretty much proactive in the sense that even defensive war, even if you're the country attacked, there's still a deliberative quality to the counterattack. It's not just that you kind of lose your temper. So here we're talking about proactive violence, proactive aggression, the kind that you're saying hasn't declined, as I understand it, in the course of our evolution.
Right.
So why don't you talk about war and maybe the prospects for ending it, which I think we'd all be in favor of?
Well, I mean, the idea about proactive aggression, this is something that is very much associated with species that hunt, because hunting is a form of proactive aggression. It's just against other species. And what happens in war is very much like hunting. And that's what happens when wolves kill wolves and when chimpanzees kill chimpanzees. There are the various animal models for proactive aggression. So in war, if you have anarchic small-scale societies like hunters and gatherers, who, as you say, they're not models at all for what happened 300,000 years ago, because we've changed a lot since then. But they give clues to the past. And what you find there is that they treat members of societies that speak a different language very much as the way chimpanzees treat chimpanzees in neighboring territories. That is to say, they're very scared of them if they see a large number, but if they have opportunities to kill members of neighboring groups safely, then they will do so. And they will even take risks in order to be able to find those opportunities. So they deliberately do that. Nowadays, of course, we have war that is much more complicated than small groups of men moving for hours or days to go off and attack a village, plonk a spear into somebody, and then run away again. That's the typical pattern of war in very small-scale societies. nowadays we have leaders and we have soldiers. And that changes a lot of the dynamic. But at the same time, a lot of it is still the same. That is to say, coalitions of males are making decisions to attack members of neighboring groups. Sometimes nowadays things have changed because females come into the coalitions and maybe even participate in the attacks. So what does this say about the prospects for peace? Well, the great thing about proactive aggression from the point of view of its suppression is that you don't expect animals or humans to conduct proactive aggression if those actors who are doing it risk getting hurt themselves. So endlessly, the aim of war at every level is to attack without getting hurt yourselves. And it's only when you have leaders who are stepping back from the front, who then send others into war, that you get really high levels of carnage from the point of view of the aggressors. Mm-hmm. The pattern of war in humans, of course, is very clear in the sense that it is not inevitable. You know, you can have particular societies that go for decades or even centuries without being involved in war. And that makes sense because of the evolutionary biology of it. Because if, in fact, you are in circumstances in which it doesn't look as though it's going to pay, then it's not going to happen. So the sort of, the short cavalier caricature good news is if we can organize a world in which the proactive aggressors themselves are liable to be hurt, then, don't expect war to happen. Mm-hmm. It's, mad, mutually assured destruction.
Yeah. So if we had put George W. Bush on the front line in Iraq, maybe there wouldn't have been an Iraq war.
Right. But, of course, we do that, then how do we do that? And so on. But that's right. I mean,
it would be worth thinking about. I don't know. Okay. So, I don't see that solution coming along anytime soon. I mean, on the other hand, you note in the book that there has been a decline in over the long haul, right? Yeah. Declining numbers of people as a percentage of the world's population. That is
right. And everyone gets annoyed with Steve Pinker because the fact that he has shown so clearly that the probability of dying from violence has been declining. People accuse him of forgetting that the probability of getting into really destructive wars has been rising because the amount of damage you can do nowadays with today's weapons is so terrifying. So we should not ever forget that point. Of course, I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, no, that's a place that makes sense to go. So yeah, it's a really fascinating book. It's got a lot of stuff we haven't had time to get into. A lot of just fascinating detail about both non-human animal behavior and a lot of interesting, ethnographic detail from societies all around the world. You had time to share a couple of those details, but it's very rich in that way. It's a book that now it's published by Basic Books, right? Which is
no, it's published by Random House.
Okay, but
Catching Fire was Basic Books.
Okay, it's published by Random House. Okay, so
yeah.
So it's a book that is both written to appeal to a lay audience, but be taken seriously by scholars. And and these are some of these arguments you've made in papers, but now you're kind of putting it together. I'm curious, just what kind of reaction have you gotten among scholars over the years to the argument you're advancing here?
Well. The coherent argument, I haven't put into papers much. Right. So really the reaction has been in maybe a dozen talks that I've given in the last few months since the book was published in late January. And I would say there's a lot of interest, but the skepticism comes from the notion that you really have to resort to execution. And, I'm pushing back on that. I mean, I think you really do have to. I think that the notion that
again, you're not favoring it. You're saying that
thank you.
that these society, I'm trying to keep you out of trouble, that these societies, if they really, it would be hard for them to eliminate the problem as they perceive it with measures less dramatic than killing.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's it.
And you're forever indebted to me for intervening at that point and making it clear that you're not championing execution.
Well, and to my wife, who insisted that I put something in about that.
Yeah, you have a whole afterword about capital punishment, don't you?
Yeah, and I feel strongly about it. I mean, I think capital punishment is disgusting, and I really do think it's time that we got rid of it.
Okay. Good note to end on. Thanks a lot. Really fascinating book, Richard, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Great to be on.